and I hope that we will be able to get the whole audience involved. So as you can see, this is what I'm going to present. Is there were three of us that were coordinators of a project that involved a number of country studies. Amani Alanchisi is unfortunately not able to join us, and she's the one that was working primarily on fitting the different country studies together. So I therefore would like to count on members of the team from the countries to speak up if in the discussion session, talk about how their case may not follow what comes out of the broad similarities and discussions we're going to discuss. So, of course, as was introduced very aptly this morning, we really start with this curse or blessing. Is oil a curse or blessing literature that's very familiar with everyone, and as you know, the evidence on it is rather mixed. It started with Sachs and Warner, who argued it was not mixed, it was a negative. Oil was a curse, and they did investigate, would that negative effect come through some other linkages, and that was institutions. That's our subject for today, is putting the emphasis on, and the answer was no, didn't in his analysis. But more recent studies that are listed there have come to different conclusions about this, or arguing that in many cases there were links that were identified, and moreover, not only was it a case that if you had these good other aspects you would get a blessing, but oil might have an effect onto the outcomes through these links. So it's mixed, but we're following up, of course, on the literature that's saying that a key link in this is the fiscal link, fiscal institutions. And these very distinguished economists are just two, but they're ones who wrote lengthy survey articles about this topic. So many existing analyses on this topic, this big project that Ibrahim al-Badawi has started and talked about was last year's topic, looking at this. So certain other regions of the world have received a fair amount of attention. Before, I think it's only recently that this attention has come to the Middle East, the MENA region, Arab countries. And for other reasons, Norway and Chile, because of various very interesting innovations that they made to deal with the problems, they've received a lot of attention. And more recently, Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, again, some of the other less benefited countries in Latin America have come to the fore because everybody pays attention to sort of disaster problems that happen. So our objective, as was consistent with the introduction, is to look more at the experience of the RRAEs, if you don't know what that is. That's the resource-rich Arab economies. And so there are advantages of studying them, but there's also the disadvantage that's already been alluded to, which is the lack of disclosure, lack of information. So that has been a barrier to, I think, almost everyone doing the country studies, as well as to us overall. But on the other hand, we feel that the benefits of focusing even just on this region are quite sizable, because you have very different lengths of experience with oil. You have the early Kuwaits and Saudi Arabia and other countries, but then much more recent experiences in Yemen and Sudan, and even Oman to some extent. You have different sizes of countries, you have different governance characteristics, monarchies, army ruling the place, different kinds of thing, and maybe even kind of chaotic conditions. You have a special case of UAE that Raimundo Soto has worked on. It's a very special one because of its federal status. So you've got a lot of differences. within the region that presumably we have to at least recognize that these different contexts, characteristics may have a substantial influence. Okay, so our work is really divided into, there are really like three chapters here. This other one, the cross-country one, is not with us right now. So we've divided into the three. One, that's our chapter 2, which I think is the one that I'm going to be talking about mostly, is taking advantage of existing data, updating what some of that data was, and learning what we can from this that hasn't already been learned. In doing this, we're considering outcomes, so what sort of factors lie behind, what sort of institutional factors lie behind these kinds of policies and problems and countries and so on, but then recognizing that the outcomes that we're looking at are multifaceted, dealing with volatility, dealing with transferring the revenues into human capital as well as physical capital, as well as trying to diversify the economy and dealing with things like the environment and distributional equity, intergenerational equity, and so on. Then Kamiyar is going to lead us on the discussion of what's the third chapter, which is the most quantitative part of it, and then finally to policy recommendations. So I'm going to go relatively quickly. So first, overall picture, not too surprising, already heard about it before, but really these resource-rich economies in the Arab region started at very low levels of capacity in dealing with things of these institutional characteristics. Varied a little bit across countries, but they're almost all starting with very sort of weak systems and budgets and fiscal institutions more broadly. Missing funds, resource governance, I'm going to show you just a slide on that. This region, these countries, your oil exporters of this region, been recognized as where it's identified the funds between oil companies and governments somehow seem to disappear. They don't add up. The worst in the world. That's at least the data is suggesting that. The most kind of lack of coherence from the data. And then low scores on the budget survey, but we find that there's a lot of progress. One of the big areas has been with really innovation from Kuwait and followed by many other countries of the region with these the sovereign wealth funds. And also the pretty consistent use of so-called low conservative estimates of the price of oil in their budgeting analysis, assuming a fairly conservative price. So it would be unlikely that things would be worse off than that. Now, that's changed, and that's a new issue. But on the other hand, we feel that there's a lot left to be done. Now the oil prices are in many cases below these estimated benchmarks. The scores on the budget, the quality of the budgets and how open they are and how good they are at dealing with risks. And same thing with the sovereign wealth funds. Even though they pioneered the sovereign wealth funds, if you compare on various characteristics the quality of the sovereign wealth funds relative to those in other countries, you see a rather shortfall. And no budgetary rules and alarmingly little progress on raising non-oil revenues, which is something to be dealt with, especially for those countries of the region that don't have huge amounts of oil or gas resources. So this is on and the numbers may be a little small to see, and I won't lead you through, but the top 3 rows are non-MENA countries, starting with Norway at the top and then followed by Brazil and Mexico. And of course, Brazil and Mexico are not typically looked at as your star performers in the world economy. But you see that those 3 countries all have really high scores on this missing funds, which is the Resource Governance Index, compared to any of the Arab countries listed. So this is just not saying there's corruption. It's this data, just that the supply of what we know about oil, the oil revenues coming in to maybe oil companies, and it just doesn't add up. So looking at the accounts, you don't see these funds. But it's a striking difference between the Arab countries and these other countries. So that's, again, cause for concern. Where is that going? Is it corruption that some people said, or is it just that the books aren't well integrated and information needs to be more available? I would hope it's the latter. This is on the Open Budget Index. This is one of these indexes that there are various people who tried to do this to identify the quality of different countries' budgeting systems, and particularly the emphasis has been on how open and how clear are these, but they also have tried to evaluate it from other perspectives. So once again, on the left-hand side are the Arab countries that are being scored on this open budget index. The blanks mean where you see a country that doesn't have anything. It's because the people doing this weren't able to get enough information to even do a score of the country. And compare that with a bunch of countries that aren't, starting with Angola and so on, that are far from star countries in the world in most characteristics. But you see their average is much higher on the scoring of budget quality than, and especially on the openness of the budget quality, than are the countries of this region. It has, I should point out, it has improved a little bit over time, but still it's way short. So it's clear that there's an issue there. A second aspect of for concern that I think came out, and this just as recently, one of the participants in the ERF in recent years has been Mahdi Majbouri, who was our student at USC actually. And so I just found out he had a paper that just came out on calculating, following the Hartwick rule. This is one of these rules, one of the several rules associated with petroleum, whereby if you follow this rule, that's really good because it shows that you're converting all of your oil, your natural resource, into either physical resources or human capital resources, and so on. So this first column, so this is just for the MENA countries, but you can see, so the KH is the ratio, divided by KA, that's the ratio of the capital that would exist in 2000, I think this was 2013, had they followed that Hartwick rule of converting all of the natural resource into either physical capital or human capital. And so you can see that where that ratio, for example, Libya, 8.4, that means that they should have, if they had saved their money from their revenues from their oil sales, they would have 8.4 times as much capital now as they actually do. The next column is showing smaller numbers for the ratio of the incomes. These are much less severe because in Mahdi Majbouri's calculations, he's using a very small share of capital in the production function. So that means that it doesn't translate into, well, there's much less capital than would have been at the maximum you could have gotten. It's not that much difference in income. But you can see that in general, the picture is pretty bad, and that it hasn't been, so there's been a huge shortfall. And the last couple of columns shows that even after you take in sovereign wealth funds, so that's a good use of these revenues, there's nothing bad about that. So that's where you take that into consideration, that brings that underachieving down, and then taking education into the picture brings it down even further. And, you know, close to the sort of high performers in this index, as you can see, are Qatar and UAE. And so the particularly quantities involved are probably not worth making a big thing of the differences. But again, you see, this is another thing. This is a challenge that the countries have fallen very far short of following this Hartwick's rule. So too little transformation of natural capital into physical capital, and human capital and financial capital. And moreover, these, especially on the efficiency of human capital, that conversion was based on all the money that was spent on education. All of those expenditures were really efficient and really produced human capital. But we heard someone testify this morning, there are doubts about that this budget on education is not really doing its job. And moreover, we don't see much in the way of agglomeration economies. This is one of the things that Adil Malik has talked about in the past especially, that you have cities, you have countries, but you don't see the region sort of being as integrated as well as you might like to see. And we also have, of course, those white elephants that he called our attention to. So the SWFs, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, these major innovation, Kuwait 1963, so we all know what it did, saved Kuwait basically. And then so the sovereign wealth funds that Ibrahim was talking about earlier are really, this is really an amazing kind of revolution in these, and they've done a lot. But still, the comparative evaluations that have been done about them in various aspects, this is by the Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute, a table. The top row is Norway, and you can see across the different categories, transparency, clarity of objectives, governance, investment, risk management. They have an overall score of 32.5. But you see that closest is the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority with a 19.25, and maybe in Bahrain is doing fairly well, and a couple of the others. Well, Kuwait's Investment Authority is also high. But still there's this huge gap between, this is what, you know, is being pioneered here, but they're not doing anywhere near as well as Norway is doing. So even in this area, there's still room for improvements, and that hopefully is the kind of thing that may come up from this new project. So major fiscal failures of most of these RRAEs, absence of fiscal rules. This has been widely acknowledged. There's no country. The closest that got to it were Algeria and Yemen in the 1990s when they were under sort of bailouts from the IMF, and IMF really made them stick to a rule for a little while, but then, you know, once they got out from under the IMF, they no longer followed the fiscal rules. Second point here is the one that's all too familiar with, I'm sure, to you all, is the excessive and sudden commitments by leaders to increase the wages or employment levels of nationals in the public sector, regardless of budgetary conditions. So this was kind of the Arab Spring response to the Arab Spring in a lot of these oil-rich countries. And that does lots of problems. There's also the failure to develop non-oil revenues that I mentioned before. Increasing vulnerability, I think this isn't yet so much on the radar screen of everyone, but to financial crises due to the non-sustainability of funds like the social security systems, the pension systems of the region, where you have rapid increases in uncovered future liabilities that I think really deserve more attention. And then the failure to reduce the subsidies, especially on energy. And I'm sure you've heard this, the IMF has been preaching this to the region for many years. But just in how you calculate these costs and turn it into specific numbers. But this one that comes from IMF study is showing, the first column is showing that pre-tax energy subsidies as a percent of GDP by country. And you can see several where this is over 10% of GDP going to this. And you can see that even though the region is very high in spending on education, it dwarfs the spending on education in many of these countries. So clearly, if you could reduce the energy subsidies, you could help deal with education even when oil prices are low. So effects of these shortcomings on outcomes, I think, are again pretty familiar, so just go over them. So already been touched on a little bit. The shortcomings in complementary institutions. Adil spoke about this this morning, these complementary institutions. So other institutions around fiscal policy, the legal system to enforce rules, ability within the government to sort of coordinate and get ministries to submit their figures to the central authorities. All of these things, these complementary institutions are so the fiscal problems also affect those things as well as vice versa. Capital formation, already talked about that, falling short of the Hartwick rule by a long shot. Efficiency in capital allocation, that also was mentioned this morning, the white elephants, bankruptcies. Human capital formation, again, a lot of expenditures, but you look at outcomes of this. You look at these international test scores, and we have tables about that, and the test scores of the region spending so much money on education, but it's rather dismal, the outcome of that. So again, efficiency problems. Economic diversification, this is of course a struggle for countries with a lot of oil anywhere in the world, but even though there have been some attempts to diversify, they've been very limited, few linkages going to other industries, and where that has been attempted, like in the 1970s, a lot of those kind of linkages in those industries didn't do very well. The weakness of private sector investment, and then what private sector investment there is, maybe this close clientelism. TFP growth, for those that look at the macroeconomy and calculate total factor productivity growth over time, and you can see it now just in the Penn World tables that gives you the calculations right there. You can see TFP growth, which is negative for most of these countries. And not surprisingly, therefore, you have low indexes of research and development expenditures, technological developments, patent applications, and you also have, unfortunately, environmental pollution problems. So what expenditures should be reduced, given that there's increasing urgency with low oil prices? What should be done? What expenditures can be reduced? So the first one would be presumably the subsidies on fuel. So I just showed you how large they are, at least depending, the estimates would vary by the methodology that was used, but nevertheless, the general picture is very clear. Huge costs, in addition to the smuggling problems that arise from smuggling out with subsidized oil and gas in a country to a neighboring country where it's not subsidized, so, and that likely to lead to corruption, it likely to lead to crime, and so on. So harmful externalities, very limited equity benefits. Again, most of the consumers of those subsidized items are, in fact, the wealthy people. So the military, that's another issue. More, already mentioned, more might be done to limit the military. So again, military is not even included in some of the budgets, and then where it is, it often is very large expenditures in terms of GDP. Excessive government salaries and pensions, that was brought up about the labor markets. I think that's a huge issue. That's not just the amount being spent on these civil servants' salaries and so on, but it's the gap that it creates between the public sector wage rates and the private sector wage rates that are so large. And this leads to a problem. Nobody wants to work in the private sector. And that was pretty clear. And then duplicative expenditures and functions across ministries and agencies. This varies a little bit by country, but in a number of the country studies, this came up as being important. No, going beyond to sort of broader fiscal policy reforms, must reduce the pro-cyclicality. This is that Kamiyara is going to emphasize, where it shows that it's this pro-cyclicality and volatility that really is part of the curse, is a large part of the curse. The rest of oil impact may be beneficial. So if you can reduce this pro-cyclicality, it's going to help a lot. The budgets, as I said, need to be more inclusive and integrated. Sort of off-budget items should be included in the budget, capital as well as current expenditure, and the writers of the country studies have called attention to this. And the oil sector, the oil companies and so on. More open disclosure within the government across ministries too. It seems to be rather sad that if you can't, within the government, you can't get accounts from other industries. How can you have a decent budgeting system where that's not the case? Not necessarily. So in general, we would be preaching from these results more openness of the budgets and so on, but not necessarily the case to that getting more actors involved in the budgets from Parliament and so on, or even outside of Parliament, may not be a desirable thing. It just accentuates the rent-seeking and everybody trying to get their share and not necessarily solving and making agreements and that kind of thing. The last point on that list is the more rigorous program evaluation. I think this is really extremely important and something that really should be done to make sure, for example, those expenditures on education for the country was mentioned, where maybe it's corruption lying behind it, that really one needs to do much more in the way of program evaluation. It seems to me that with the program evaluation, then you could have various parties, then you can have a basis of criticizing, well, look, you did spend all this money on this, but look what came out, not much. So that, I think, provides a good way in which broader involvement can be very helpful. Encourage regional collaboration in the production of public goods. On the investment side, more in the way of sort of regional cooperation. How could we might help get there? I would recommend joining the EITI, that's this transparency initiative for extractive industries, Transparency Institute, and the Institute for Sovereign Wealth Funds. They have some evidence that they've shown that if you do join those organizations, you're learning from each other. You submit your books, you get some criticism, you get some advice, and it showed that over time, with those memberships, you improve your scores on these different qualities of budgets or different qualities of sovereign wealth funds. So I think I'll try to just see if there's anything else that needs to be. So more competitive bidding. I think that in this area of transforming the oil revenues into infrastructure and physical capital, which they're already sort of falling short of in some respects, but the efficiency could be helped a lot if there was competitive bidding insisted on. Turkey, for example, the ERF, we had some wonderful papers showing the impact of competitive bidding on government expenditures. urgency of reform because of this period of low oil prices looks like it could be one that would be a little bit longer than those in the past, and could be very serious unless the countries do really adjust quickly to hopefully pick up some of these suggestions we have made. Improve efficiency, competitiveness, reduce weight. Beyond fiscal policy, exchange rate policy that is certainly relevant. That was discussed earlier. It should be noted that Indonesia, which is one of the oil countries in the original oil shocks of the 1970s, they offset a lot of the negative effects by devaluating. And Azerbaijan, not far from here, has done that recently. So I think that more attention should be given to exchange rate policy. And this is especially important now because, for the region, because they're to the extent they're tied to the dollar, and the dollar is so highly valued right now. So that makes it very hard for anything else to be sort of competitive in the world market. Privatization, banks, that was very nicely alluded to, I think, in Adil's discussion about moving towards more privatization. Political economy. So I won't go into this in some detail, but one thing that is clear is that the country does have a lot of monarchies in this region, and that monarchies have tended to be, keeping things private within the family kind of thing, and therefore that's part of the reason why there has not been more disclosure about various things. And so therefore, if these policies almost all involve opening up budgets, opening up between ministries, changing the budget structure, doing careful evaluations of all the expenditures. So to the extent that therefore monarchies are sort of running these countries, to be feasible, to be politically feasible, it should be that these effects of the budget should be beneficial to the monarchies themselves as well as to the general public. Otherwise, why would they want to do this? And so I won't go into it, and I'm still working on this further, is trying to show that indeed I think that monarchies have a potentially much longer look at things, so they can look at the longer perspective, that it's their grandchildren that might be inheriting the monarchy, and therefore they have more incentives to have this long perspective, which means that it would be in their interest to make these changes while they still can, to be politically feasible. So I'll stop there.